We got some people still popping on, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this month's Tri-State Dairy Exchange webinar, where we're talking about advancing dairy systems through technology. Today, we are going to be talking about getting the most out of your wearable data. And then next month, we shift into looking at integrated farming solutions with Dairy One. And then in May, we will talk about crop and nutrient management. So we've got some pretty exciting stuff coming up. For anyone that might be new here, our Tri-State Dairy team is a group of extension professionals from Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, where our goal is to advance dairy management, address shared industry challenges, and foster innovation through collaborative educational programs across northern New England. So our team consists of myself, Sarah Allen from UNH, Dr. Glenda Pereira from the University of Maine, and then from the University of Vermont, we have Whitney, Kelsey, and Amber on as well. So some of our events have kind of calmed down a little bit as we're getting into the cropping season, but in Maine, you can look forward to new episodes of the Maine Farmcast every Wednesday. And then in New Hampshire, coming up in just tomorrow, we have a workshop on strategies for selling safe food at New Hampshire's farmers markets. And then on April 10th, we have a workshop looking at boom sprayer calibration and tune-ups. And Amber, do you want to talk about Vermont?
Sure. For Vermont, the Vermont Dairy Farm of the Year Award is presented annually by the UVM Extension and Vermont Dairy Industry Association in cooperation with the New England Green Pastures Program. And the winning farm is selected based on excellent in pasture, crop, and herd management, quality milk production, land stewardship, and innovative practices. And that program is now accepting applications. So we will drop the link for the nomination form into the chat. And if you're interested in more information about this program in our tri-state area, you can check out our March 2025 webinar, which is focused on the 2024 Farm of the Year awardees, and we can put that link in our chat also. And we're also excited to be launching a new farm tour series in Vermont early this summer. The farm tours will focus on dairy farms that excel in some aspect of risk management, which is pretty broad because pretty much anything that falls into that category for dairy farmers. So we'll be planning some farm visits for farms that are utilizing interesting technologies, accessing diverse markets, or employing unique management strategies to support their businesses. These will be held at farms across the state in 2026 and 2027. We haven't solidified our dates and locations yet, but you should keep an eye on our conferences and events page for updates, and we'll link that in the chat as well.
Great, thanks. And both Maine and New Hampshire are also either accepting or getting ready to accept nominations for their Dairy Farm of the Year as well. So I'll throw in the link for New Hampshire's nomination process as well. So our featured resource this month is the Ohio Dairy Industry Resource Center, run by Ohio State's University Extension, which is a key hub for dairy producers, offering research, extension, and news through their website and publications like the Buckeye Dairy News. They focus on topics from manure management, milk quality, farm finance. Again, all of that is run by their extension service. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Dr. Claira Seeley. Dr. Seeley is an assistant professor here at the University of New Hampshire, where she focuses on dairy cow physiology and precision technologies. So Claira, I will let you take it over.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. All right, hold on, let me make this present. All right, is everyone seeing that? All looks okay? Okay, excellent. So thanks everybody for joining and the invitation to give this webinar. So I was asked to talk about how we can get the most out of our precision technology data. And as Dr. Allen alluded to, one of my other areas of expertise and interest is physiology, specifically in the early lactation and transition period in dairy cows. So We merge those two things together. That's largely what my research program here at UNH focuses on. So today I'm really going to highlight how we can utilize precision technology data to optimize fresh cow management to, really highlight and get the most out of our cows throughout their lactation. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today, starting with just getting us all on the same page, a brief physiology lesson on why bad things happen during the transition period. All of the risks, we just talked about risk assessment and things like that. So what are the risks for our early lactation cows? Then we'll move into the space where technology fits into that picture, and then discuss how we can turn data into decisions and how we can harness all of this data we're getting from our precision technologies to make some management changes, considering other things that may affect how we use and how we interpret that data. And then I'll end with some key takeaways, how we can draw all of this together for some real world applications. So our physiology lesson here, right? Why do we care about the transition period? I'm sure you're all very well aware, but we generally define that transition period as 3 weeks before and after calving, so that late dry period and very early lactation. In the late dry period, here in this orange line, right, we have our energy intake for our cow. And then in the blue line, we have energy requirements. You can see that energy intake meets the energy requirements for that cow, right? She's largely an easy keeper at that phase. That's why we feed our controlled energy rations. We don't want our cows getting too fat, and she can easily meet the energy requirements day to day. However, after that cow calves in and she starts making large volumes of milk, which we've bred our cows to do in the last, several decades, her energy requirements skyrocket as she starts producing, 50, 60, 70 pounds of milk in the first day or two of lactation. And at that time, for a variety of factors, she struggles to consume enough feed to meet the energy requirement that she has to make those large volumes of milk. So all in all, there's many physiological changes rapidly occurring in those days and hours surrounding the time of calving, paired with those increased nutritional and energetic requirements. And along with all of these challenges, there's many internal and external stressors facing those cows, right? She's moved from the dry pen to the calving pen to the fresh cow pen. Maybe she's a primiparous cow thrown in with multiparous cows. There are a lot of stressors that are going to further exacerbate those physiological challenges that cow is already experiencing in that early lactation period. So lots of things going on, right? And largely we highlight this early lactation period as a time of energy deficit for that cow. She simply cannot consume enough feed to meet her energetic requirements. So just to highlight 3 main tenets that we really worry about in that early lactation period that can have long-lasting impacts on that cow's overall health and productivity. This again is sort of where my lab focuses our work, hence why we'll talk about it today. But first, talking about the increase in calcium requirements for that early lactation cow. After she calves in a matter of several hours, right, as she starts producing colostrum and milk, her calcium requirements more than double. And this is a huge metabolic shift for that animal and a tremendous challenge to overcome. Luckily for the cow, though, she has a variety of homeostatic mechanisms in place that allow her to restore and then maintain blood calcium concentrations in that early lactation period. We could spend an entire hour talking about that, which I will not do. However, know that sometimes these homeostatic mechanisms do not work as they should. They're just not working hard enough, and that cow is still going to succumb to low blood calcium concentrations, which then will manifest as hypocalcemia. And we'll talk about different manifestations in a second. Other side of the coin, right? Again, that cow is experiencing an energy deficit, right? She's producing large volumes of milk and she cannot eat enough to meet those energetic requirements. So in this instance, cows again have biological mechanisms in place that allow them to shift to alternative fuel sources, such as the mobilization of fat stores, right? That's why we see loss of body condition. She mobilizes fat and can use that as an alternative fuel source to support that energy deficit state that she's in. And this is all well and good, right, for a little while to a certain extent. However, when we reach the tipping point, which again, we could sit here for an hour and argue what is too much fat mobilization, what is too much BHB in the blood, but that's when we're going to see ketosis and the negative ramifications associated with that, when we just are overutilizing those alternative fuel sources. And then at the same time, we have a certain degree of systemic inflammation occurring in that early lactation period. Giving birth is a traumatic, stressful event, and in order to recover from that, naturally, we do need some inflammation to allow tissues to come back to normal. We need uterine involution. But just like our calcium and our energy sides of the coin, right, when that goes on for too long, for too much, that's when we're going to have negative long stream, ramifications and outcomes. And the trouble is here, we like to call this the web of death, right? You're not just going to have hypocalcemia or just have ketosis or inflammation. Likely these three tenets of badness that happen to our early lactation cows feed off of each other and exacerbate one another, and then can perpetuate these long-term outcomes such as reduced feed intake, reduced milk production, reduced reproductive success, and just general lack of good health in these cows. So our web of death leads to the all-encompassing badness, as we like to say in my lab. Okay, and then the other trouble with our transition cows is cows are prey animals, right? They are really good at hiding when they don't feel well, because in the wild, when we have our wild dairy cows, right, you don't want to show the predator that you don't feel well. So many of our transition cow disorders manifest subclinically. So they're invisible to us as we just walk the pen and look at our cows. They're going to the milk parlor, they're going to the feed bunk, they appear normal. However, if we take a blood sample and analyze calcium, BHB, some sort of inflammatory marker, we will realize that they do indeed have some sort of subclinical metabolic disruption. And so in that instance, we do need a blood sample to actually diagnose these cows experiencing subclinical disease. These blood samples, they're great, right? We have the ability to analyze a variety of metabolites. However, it's laborious. You have to go find the cow, lock her up, take the blood sample, what have you. Also costs money. It's not free, unfortunately. It's whenever we write grants and do projects, that's a big part of our budget is writing in to actually get the money to analyze these blood samples. And even if you're just looking at one cow, that adds up. And more importantly than the labor and money aspect is the time it actually takes to both collect that blood sample, but then send it to a lab and get your answer back. And by the time you figure out what is this cow's blood calcium concentration, your window of opportunity to actually treat and mitigate that disorder has likely passed. So that is unfortunate, right? However, this is where our technology can fit in and actually help us. So if we have rumination monitors or ear tags or boluses in these cows, we're getting real-time data 24/7 on each of our cows in that early lactation period that we can use perhaps as an alternative to our blood samples to make more informed management decisions, mitigating that need to actually collect the blood sample, send it to a lab, and having that long-lasting, wait time before we can make a decision. Oops. Okay, hold on. My clicker stopped. Okay, there we go. All right. The trouble, though, technology is great. However, we kind of live in a world of data overload. So these are just some snapshots of precision data, rumination, activity time from a variety of cows on our farms here at UNH. But this is a lot to look at, right? And if you have 100, 200, even 30 cows, this is a lot of data to comb through every single day to figure out how can you use these squiggly lines to make more informed decisions about your cows. Furthermore, we get all these health alerts, which again are great, but sometimes can be rather ambiguous. And how do you interpret that and turn that into a decision for a specific cow? And if you're like me and opt into the emails and the text messages, again, you're just inundated with all of this information. And it's really hard to decide what you're actually going to do with that to turn it into a useful decision on the farm. So this is where research fits in, right? We get all of this data and we could make a million mathematical models to tell us all the things in the world, but we really do need some research to back up physiologically what we're seeing with this data. So in my lab and other labs that focus on this precision technology data, we are still out collecting blood samples, running lab analysis, and then using those analysis backed up by our precision technology data to figure out what do these patterns in rumination mean in terms of biologically what is happening with that cow. So then we as researchers can come to farmers, veterinarians, nutritionists, and say, hey, this pattern means X, Y, or Z, and we can turn that into an actual decision. So just to start simple, it's important to understand what normal, if you will, looks like during that transition period when we're looking at our precision technology data, because there is just so much of it. It is good to understand what is baseline, what would we expect. So this figure here, we have day relative to calving. On our x-axis, we start 14 days relative to calving, and we have calving and then looking about 30 days postpartum. And we have primiparous and multiparous cows here, and then rumination time on the Y. And you can see as we approach calving, we see a slight reduction in rumination time, just like we would see with intake, right? She's getting ready to give birth. The day of calving, we see a very steep reduction in rumination time. Again, that's a stressful event. She's probably not feeling super great. That's what we would expect. But within several days after calving, we can see rumination time has come back up and also leveled out. That's the most important thing here. We've returned to what we're going to call baseline rumination time, and we have reached consistent times of rumination throughout the day. And again, we also will generally see lower rumination times in our primiparous cows compared to our multiparous. However, one could then ask the question, does this look different when a cow experiences a transition cow disorder, hypocalcemia, ketosis, some sort of inflammation, right? This is a very pretty graph here, but if she has some sort of metabolic disruption, how is that reflected in her rumination time? And so to start with ketosis, a group about 10 years ago now, as precision technologies were coming to the forefront, sought to look at the relationship between ketosis and rumination time. And so to do this, this group enrolled 202 multiparous Holstein cows, and they used SCR collars to measure rumination time. Then they went out and took blood samples, right, because we need to back up the physiology behind this technology data. And they diagnosed cows as either being healthy, so no transition cow disorders whatsoever. And then they had a group that they deemed ketotic, so they had a blood BHB of greater than 1.2 millimoles per liter at some time between 0 and 28 days in milk. Then they had a third group of cows that had ketosis as well as some other health problem during that period of time. And their mean day of ketosis diagnosis was about a week post-calving. And then they looked at rumination time in both the prepartum period, as you can see here, and the postpartum period, just to see if there was some relationship between that health status and what rumination looked like. So in our prepartum period, you can see that the healthy cows here with the black circle actually maintained higher rumination times compared to those cows that would develop ketosis and some other health issue as we approached calving. Looking post-calving, though, this is where things got interesting. You can see that the healthy cows and the cows that just had ketosis actually had similar rumination times during that early lactation period with those healthy, with the ketotic plus some other health event having reduced rumination. And so we could sit here and hypothesize why we saw this. My thinking is, right, something else occurred, probably some clinical disorder that tipped that cow over the edge in our ketosis plus group, causing that reduced rumination. So there wasn't a huge difference between just ketosis and healthy, but add another factor to that equation, and then we see that reduced rumination in that early lactation period. Another study around the same time, we're interested to see if alerts that were auto-generated by an SCR system were able to detect ketosis. So these would just send out general health alerts, a little ding to the farmer, and they were curious to see if by doing some fancy statistics, they could identify specific disorders using these auto-generated alerts. So to do this study, they enrolled 484 Holstein cows, again using SCR and just the auto-generated alert from SCR to go out and check cows. And then they had 3 different groups. So they had cows that were non-diseased, so these were their healthy cows. Then they had cows that they called health alert negative. So these cows had ketosis, which they diagnosed by taking a blood sample, but no alert was generated. So the SCR system didn't think that the cow was sick. And then they had cows that did have ketosis and generated an alert. So they were diagnosed with ketosis by the research staff, and that rumination system dinged the farmer as to, hey, this cow isn't feeling well, you should go take a look at her. And they looked at rumination time with the day relative to diagnosis. So when they actually went out and took that blood sample to diagnose ketosis. And you can see here the main takeaway of this graph. We're going to highlight first our non-diseased or healthy, if you will, cows. So that's in this black line, and you can see the rumination time was relatively consistent. Again, this is day relative to diagnosis, so focusing on our ketosis group cows. But here in our healthy group, rumination did not change. But you can see that in the cows that actually generated an alert and had ketosis had significantly reduced rumination time compared to those healthy cows. So this alert system did a very good job of differentiating between our healthy and our diseased cows. So that's the main takeaway from that. It's rather convoluted, if you will, statistics, but just take my word that we did see that difference in rumination time between our ketotic and non-ketotic groups. Similarly, they looked at activity time. That was also factored into these auto-generated alerts by the system. And again, looking at our healthy cows here in black and our ketotic cows here in the open circle, we saw a significant reduction in activity time in our ketotic cows compared to those healthy animals. So all in all, this system did a pretty good job of differentiating between healthy and not healthy. And another group, again around the same time, wanted to know if we could use prepartum rumination time to inform us of cows that were going to develop ketosis postpartum. Because it would be great, right, if we could identify these cows beforehand, mitigate the disorder early on, and avoid all of those long-term ramifications. So this was a pretty small study, only 32 cows, but they divided their cows into long, medium, and short rumination groups for the last several days prepartum. So looking at prepartum rumination time. Oops, this keeps, there we go. All right, and so first, looking at the prepartum period in terms of rumination time, we have our short ruminators here in our open diamonds, and you can see they, as the name alludes to, ruminated less than our long ruminators here in the triangle with our medium ruminators in the middle. Not surprising. We look into the postpartum period, and those groups persist through about 3 weeks in calving, or post-calving, right, with our short ruminators continuing to ruminate less than those medium and long ruminating cows. Then, to address their actual question and research hypothesis, they measured blood BHB across that transition period to see if there was some difference in BHB between the duration of ruminators. And you can see here, prepartum, there was very little difference in blood BHB between our long, medium, and short ruminating cows. However, postpartum, particularly looking about 3 weeks post-calving, you can see that those short ruminating cows, so the cows that ruminated less in that week leading up to calving, actually had significantly elevated BHB 3 weeks post-calving compared to those medium and long ruminating cows. So this is pretty interesting, suggesting that perhaps that last week of calving, looking at rumination time and patterns, could be somewhat indicative of metabolic status postpartum. So this was pretty interesting, but again, a very small sample size. So that's something to consider as we think about this data. Okay, so now switching gears a little bit to hypocalcemia, right? One of those other big hitters of transition cow disorders. Calcium is my favorite mineral, right? It's important for a variety of bodily functions. It's critical for muscle contractions. And importantly, that means rumen contractions for our dairy cows, right? You have no calcium, you cannot ruminate. So several years ago now, one of the big calcium researchers in the industry, if you will, wanted to see if there was a relationship between blood calcium concentrations in that immediate postpartum period and rumination time in the early lactation period. So in this graph here, we have blood calcium concentrations at 6 hours post-calving on our x-axis, and then we have rumination time in the first day in milk on our y-axis. And they just wanted to plot the relationship between the two. And you can see as these cows had increased blood calcium concentrations in that first 6 hours post-calving, they actually had increased rumination time in that first day as well. And this is a pretty strong correlation here. So this was promising, right? Higher blood calcium, the more you ruminate. They fast forwarded to 2 days in milk as well. So they were then interested to see if that blood calcium measured 6 hours post-calving was related to 2-day in milk rumination time. And again, they saw a positive correlation, but not quite as strong as that 1 day. So suggesting there's some carryover, but perhaps not as strong as we saw in that first day. But this again was promising and made sense, right? You don't have calcium, you cannot ruminate. So the more calcium you have, the higher rumination time we're going to see in that early lactation period. Most drastically, in the same study, they also had several cows that developed milk fever, and they were interested to see what rumination time did when a cow developed milk fever. So these graphs are going to get kind of busy, so we're going to walk through it quickly first. So we'll have a blue line here that is plasma calcium, so blood calcium. That's going to be reflected in our right-hand y-axis. They also measured rumination time in 2-hour increments. So instead of every day, they looked at it in a very short period of time. It's going to be in a red line. And then they also administered IV calcium to these cows because they had clinical milk fever, and that'll be marked with an arrow. And then we have hour relative to calving here on our x-axis. So here's our first cow. You can see, looking first at our blue line, this is blood calcium leading up to calving. She calves in, blood calcium plummets, she has milk fever. Here in the arrow, we give her a bottle of IV calcium. We see a little increase in blood calcium, and then about a day later, that's when we really see her blood calcium come back up. But when we look at her rumination, we see a very similar pattern to blood calcium in that rumination time, right? With up and downs as we come to calving. But when that cow goes down with milk fever, rumination basically flatlines. And I'm sure if any of you have rumination collars, you've seen cows with milk fever and you see this exact pattern in those cows. And our systems do a very good job of identifying milk fever because, like I said before, you don't have calcium, you cannot ruminate, so you're not going to pick up any rumination. Similar story, they had another cow with milk fever. And again, when that cow went down, we had a flat line of rumination time. So these are very good at identifying milk fever cases. However, as we know, many cows experience subclinical disorders, right? So can we use rumination time to identify what we're now calling dyscalcemia or subclinical hypocalcemia? So like I mentioned, calcium is one of my favorite minerals, and we've done a lot of work looking at different blood calcium dynamics and how those relate to outcomes. And we've found that actually low blood calcium at 4 days in milk, generally less than 8.82 milligrams per deciliter, that's more associated or more strongly associated, if you will, with decreased milk production, decreased reproductive success, as well as decreased intake. So that's our new term here, dyscalcemia, if you will. But again, this is occurring subclinically. So to address this question, right, is there a relationship between rumination time and this subclinical hypocalcemia? We did a project where we enrolled 182 multiparous Holstein cows on 2 farms, and we used SCR ear tags to measure rumination time. And we looked for the 2 weeks leading up to calving and then the 2 weeks post-calving at rumination time and collected a blood sample at 4 days in milk to truly diagnose our cows as dyscalcemic or eucalcemic, right, having good blood calcium. You can see here in that prepartum period, we have our dyscalcemic in red and our eucalcemic in blue. That rumination time was very similar between the 2 groups of cows as we approached calving. However, post-calving, our eucalcemic cows, so cows that had good blood calcium, immediately took off. Rumination just steadily chugged back up, right? They reached baseline around a week post-calving. But then our dyscalcemic cows here in our red triangles, particularly within the first 24 or so hours, had very little increase in rumination time, and then a slower return to that baseline or normal rumination compared to those eucalcemic cows. So this was very interesting to us and led us to ask the question, hey, using this data, could we predict if a cow is going to get dyscalcemia or not, looking at these changes in rumination time? And so when we made our fancy statistical models, we found that with 77% accuracy, we were actually able to predict dyscalcemia and eucalcemia using rumination time in those first several days post-calving. So this was very promising, especially considering that the sample size was relatively small for statistical modeling. So this is, still a work in progress, but suggests that there is some utility here in predicting health outcomes using rumination. In the same study, we also looked at activity time. Again, 2 weeks prepartum and then 2 weeks postpartum. And you can see here prepartum, there was a bit of a difference in activity time, but nothing statistically so. But then post-calving, our eucalcemic cows maintained higher activity time compared to our dyscalcemic cows, and this difference persisted through 2 weeks post-calving. And I'm not sure why this occurred. It's something that I still scratch my head about and wonder, and I would also like to know how long does this difference persist? So if anyone has any thoughts or comments, I would love to hear them. So this is something we will continue to work on as we move forward. Okay, our final tenet of the all-encompassing badness that can happen to our transition cows, inflammation. This is the big hitter, right? And again, all of these disorders likely perpetuate and feed off of one another. And inflammation is sort of new to the picture here. So we're still figuring out how inflammation fits in, but there is a little bit of data looking at rumination and activity time and how that influences or affects inflammation. So this is a relatively small study. They only enrolled 23 cows, and they grouped their cows into high and low ruminating groups based on rumination time in 3 to 6 days postpartum. This figure just nicely illustrates that, right? We have -20 to the day of calving, and then the first 40 days in lactation with rumination time on our y-axis. And you can see here, this period right after calving is where they grouped their cows based on rumination time, with those high ruminators ruminating significantly more, ruminating significantly more than those low ruminators. But more importantly, they measured haptoglobin in blood. Now, haptoglobin is what's called an acute phase protein. So when a cow experiences a stressful or immunologically challenging event, we're going to see a very quick increase in haptoglobin, followed by a very quick decrease in haptoglobin. This will initiate other inflammatory responses, but we do like to see that quick resolution in haptoglobin. It's common for cows to have an increase in haptoglobin after the time of calving. Again, it's a stressful event. We would expect to see that. And so here you can see those high ruminating cows, right, have that steep increase followed by a very steep decrease. But then interestingly, our low ruminating cows reach a similar peak of haptoglobin compared to those high ruminating cows, but have a more sustained and slower reduction back to normal concentrations than those high ruminators, suggesting that there is some relationship there between rumination time, with those short ruminators taking longer to resolve inflammation compared to those high ruminators. However, like I mentioned, inflammation has just entered the picture in terms of transition cow biology, as well as where the precision technology fits in. So there's more to come here. Maybe I'll come back next year and we can talk more about inflammation and how it's reflected in our precision technology data, but we're working on it. And again, we're still really figuring out how this puzzle of transition cow disorders and precision technology fit together. Our understanding of transition cow biology is still evolving. These arrows that I have here likely go both ways, right? It's not just a wheel spinning clockwise. It probably spins both ways all the time. And we're still fleshing out the etiology of all of these disorders and how our data fits in. So again, we'll come back in a few years and we'll probably have even more data to overwhelm ourselves with. But back to the picture of transition cows and how we can utilize this data as best as possible. We were wondering, can we identify problem cows before they even calve in? That would be great, right? If a week, 2 weeks before she calves, we already have a list of cows based on their precision technology data that we really need to focus on and give tailored management to. So to first address this question, A group in Michigan several years ago wanted to see if there was a relationship between rumination time at the time of dry off, so well before she calved, with early lactation cow health disorders. So they had a huge amount of data from close to 2,000 cows. And first, they looked at hyperketonemia or ketosis in that early lactation period. And they looked at rumination time around the day of dry off. So again, well before she calves in, they wanted to see if rumination time at that time of dry off had any influence on the likelihood of her developing ketosis in the days following calving. And so here in this graph, we're going to have cows that did not have ketosis in a pink colored square, and our cows that did have ketosis in a little purple circle. And our day relative to dry off is right here, indicated by a 0. And you can see when we look at rumination time between those two groups, very little difference in terms of rumination time between cows that will develop ketosis and will not. So that's a bit of a bummer. We then also look at lameness in this study. So similar classification, cows that are not going to be lame early lactation versus those that will be lame in that purple circle. Similar to ketosis, there was very little difference between rumination time. However, there was a bit of statistical difference in terms of rumination in the days surrounding dry off, with those cows that would not be lame ruminating a bit more than those cows that would be lame. So again, this is rather hard to interpret, if you will. Take what you will from this data. However, I do think that there is promise in looking at patterns of rumination time well before she calves in on the likelihood of disorders occurring early lactation. So again, we're still working on that, but perhaps something is there. Another group also sought to look at prepartum rumination time and the incidence of early lactation cow disorders. They did choose to look a little closer to calving, though, not all the way out at dry off. And so for here, this study, they had 536 primi and multiparous cows and looked at rumination time pre and postpartum, and then looked at health disorders in that early lactation period. And so they grouped their cows into 3 different groups based on rumination time during the last week of pregnancy. So instead of looking all the way out to dry off, they focused on the 7 days leading up to calving, and they grouped their cows as long, medium, and short ruminators. This graph nicely illustrates that. So here we have day relative to calving, our 3 weeks leading up to calving, rumination here on our Y, and you can see in gray, we have our long ruminators ruminating the most, in orange, our medium, and then in blue, our short. So that nicely illustrates their classification scheme. Postpartum, rumination patterns persist, again with those long ruminators consistently ruminating more than the medium and short. So again, this just nicely highlights their classification scheme. They also, again, looked at health disorders, and they found that there was no difference in the number of clinical health events between these 3 different groups of cows. However, they found that the cows in that short ruminating group, so the ones that ruminated the less, actually had an increase in odds of developing metritis and a uterine disease compared to those medium and long ruminators. So while there was no difference in clinical health events, those short ruminators were more likely to get metritis and uterine disease compared to the other longer ruminating groups. They also measured a variety of blood metabolites to see if there was any difference in terms of internal markers between the rumination groups. And they found here, first looking at BHB, that those short ruminators actually maintained higher BHB concentrations from 14 to 12 days post-calving compared to the medium and long ruminators. And what was really interesting to me, right, I said that there wasn't a ton of work done on inflammation. This study is one of the other several to look at inflammation and rumination time. And they looked here at haptoglobin, and just like that small study I showed you earlier, they found that the short ruminators not only had a higher peak in haptoglobin concentration, but again had a more sustained and slower return to normal compared to those medium and long ruminating cows. They added to this story by also looking at albumin. Now, albumin is a positive acute phase protein. So when that cow experiences some sort of stress or immunological activation, we're actually going to see a decrease in albumin concentrations. So, as one would expect, our long ruminators maintained relatively consistent concentrations of albumin across that transition period, but then our short ruminators, who again had the highest concentrations of haptoglobin, the most inflammation, had the lowest concentrations of albumin. So this to me suggests there is something there relating our inflammation status with rumination time. So again, we're still building on this picture, but we're heading in the right direction. All right, this group also looked at milk yield because again, we could go out and take all the blood samples in the world and measure every metabolic marker, but in the end, it really comes down to what is making us money, what is costing us money. So they looked at milk production. This graph is a little hard to interpret and see. We have our multiparous cows here on the top in a dashed line and primiparous cows on the bottom. And it's difficult to see the differences in milk production at this in this visual. However, if we just focus on our multiparous cows here and look at total milk yield over the 305-day lactation, you can see that numerically those short ruminators actually produced less milk over the course of their lactation compared to those medium and long ruminators. Now from this, we can't tell, is it rumination time that is directly driving milk production? Is it whatever metabolically is happening to those cows? We still need to flush that out. However, this study does suggest that looking at those patterns of rumination prepartum can at least indicate to us how she's going to do productively and health-wise over the course of her lactation. Okay, that was a lot of data. I just showed a million graphs that, maybe if you were my students, probably be falling asleep by this point. So what does this really mean for your farm, right? How do you put this data that I just presented to you to good use in an actual productive setting? My first big tip, key, whatever, takeaway is to know your normal. So this is a graph that my grad student put together for me. We have 2 dairy farms here on campus at UNH. We have a conventional herd that is in a Tysol, and then we have an organic Jersey herd several miles off campus. And my grad student Kayla put together this graph for me of all of our cows in the past year that have calved in at both farms. And this just nicely highlights what our normal is, right? Each herd has their own baseline rumination time, but looking at this, we can pretty well see what we would expect on our herd. The best thing, though, is to compare a cow to her own normal. So identifying, being able to see what is her baseline and comparing the cow to herself. Very, very key. So what do we mean by baseline exactly? Now, this is some data from another one of our cows here on campus. We have SmaxTech boluses in all of our cows. SmaxTech can measure rumination, which will be in a green line. We also can measure rumen temperature, which will be in a blue line, and activity time in a red line. And this is just going to illustrate a cow's rumination and SmaxTech data in the 5 days pre and postpartum. Now you can see here, if we highlight our green line, this is rumination time, prepartum. She's going along relatively steadily. We see a decrease in the day leading up to calving. Then she calves. And then postpartum, we see a bit of a reduction in rumination in that first day postpartum, but she nicely returns to what we're going to call her baseline within 2 days postpartum. Now, this is the ideal cow, right? She went on to have no problems. She made a fine amount of milk. This is our ideal transition period rumination graph, if you will. Now we have another cow here, also on one of our farms on campus. You can see leading up to calving, rumination is relatively consistent. She calves in, but then we look at her graph, largely focusing on rumination in this green line, lots of peaks and valleys. And I don't know about you, but even to an untrained eye, it's very hard to find baseline here, right? There is no return to normal, if you will. Long story short, this cow had about 2 days in milk, had milk fever. We see a very steep drop in rumination, reduction in temperature. That is to be expected. Fast forward several more days, then she got pneumonia. And then fast forward about a week or 2 into lactation, then she got mastitis. And I'm pretty sure she got cold several days after this. So nicely highlights that when we have that lack of return to baseline, things are not going great for these animals. This cow is a very good example of that, and all the things that could go wrong went wrong with this poor cow. However, what about subclinical disorders? The cow that I just showed you, she had many clinical disorders that were easy to identify and see, but we're really interested in those cows with invisible diseases, right? We want to eliminate taking blood samples. So how can we use this data and our understanding of baseline to detect subclinical issues? So this cow was on a research study that we recently finished up at our organic dairy. You can see here she calves and then has not substantially reduced rumination, but really fails to come back up to baseline and has these prolonged reductions in rumination that, make us scratch our head a little bit. So we did take blood samples on this cow because she was on a research project. And at 4 days in milk, we took a blood cell calcium sample, and she had a blood calcium of 7.2 milligrams per deciliter. That's pretty low. That falls below that threshold of dyscalcemia. We also measured BHB at 6 days in milk. She had a BHB of 2.8 millimoles per liter. Now, I will say this cow looked totally fine. We were out at the farm every day. She appeared normal. Only when we measured and looked at our lab analyses of calcium and BHB did we find out that she was indeed experiencing these subclinical metabolic disruptions. So with this in mind, could we have done something for this cow at 3 days in milk or 2 days in milk before we actually had this manifestation of subclinical hypocalcemia and ketosis? Perhaps we could have given her a calcium bolus at 2 or 3 days in milk, maybe kept her in the hospital pen for a little bit longer to really optimize intake and have more tailored management of that cow. So this is really where we're focusing our attention now. So using these patterns of rumination, that lack of return to baseline, can we make more informed decisions on specific cows? So to tie it all together, putting all of that data that I showed you before into some red flags for our subclinical disorders in early lactation cows. So things to keep in mind, right? Was her rumination low before she calved? Is it lower than your herd average, than what you would expect her rumination to be, right? There were several studies that looked at that rumination in the week or so leading up to calving, suggesting that those prolonged reductions are indicative of some sort of metabolic disruption postpartum. Similarly, we expect a reduction in rumination around the time of calving, but was it greater than 20 to 30% of what you would have expected her rumination to be, right? Was it really, really, really low? That's not great. Are there a lot of fluctuations in her rumination time? This is also very important. Like that cow I showed you with the subclinical hypocalcemia and ketosis, right? Her rumination wasn't flatlining, but there was ups and downs, prolonged periods of time where there was not an increase. This again is a red flag. And then is her rumination still low at 4 to 7 days in milk? That's when we really should start to be concerned, right? Intake should be coming up by that point. Rumination is not an exact proxy of intake, but can give us a pretty good idea of how she's feeling. So that cow we probably should go take a look at. And all these together are likely indicative or suggestive of some sort of metabolic disruption that we cannot see with our eyes, but are being able to understand looking at her rumination data. So to turn that data into action, we can use rumination time as well as other data on our farm to prioritize fresh cow checks. So those cows with, as I like to say, wonky rumination patterns, those are the cows we can go conduct a more thorough exam on. Perhaps these are the cows that we actually take a blood sample from to look at calcium, look at BHB. That can give us a good idea of our herd's incidence of subclinical hypocalcemia, subclinical ketosis, and then perhaps from there we can make some nutritional or management changes to address that problem. We can also strategize prophylactic treatments, right? Maybe we don't need to give calcium boluses to every single cow. We can highlight those animals that have that prolonged reduction in rumination time. Maybe those are the ladies that we actually give our boluses to. We'll get the most money out of that bolus. So then finally, we can also strategize pen moves. In this instance, again, like the cow I showed you before, perhaps we should have kept her in the hospital pen longer. If she took off and was looking great, we could move her right to the, high pen if space is limited. So using this data, we can make more informed decisions and action plans to optimize the production and health of our cows. All that to say, though, is we still need people, right? Technology is great, and I love looking at data and I love thinking about what it means for our cows, but we cannot replace technology, or we cannot replace humans with technology. We still need cow people to go out there and look at our cows, analyze that data, put it together with biologically what is happening. So we still need people. Technology is just a really great tool in our toolbox. So just to summarize, my too long didn't read. Trends and baselines, understanding your farm's baseline and cow's baseline, is much more important and will tell you a lot more than a single alert or ding from your precision technology, right? There's alerts up the wazoo, but knowing how that relates to a baseline and a normal is very important. And technology, again, is amazing, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. It's going to work best when we pair it with good and consistent nutrition programs. You could implement every single precision technology in the world, but if your nutrition is not good or consistent, it will be useless to us. Similarly, we need strong transition cow management programs and consistent protocols. Again, we could put every single monitor on our cows, but if we don't have a transition cow management program to start with, the data is not going to mean anything, right? And starting simple and building over time is the key to success. We get so much data. I think if anything from this presentation, you could understand we have data overload with our technology. So my recommendation to you, if you're implementing precision tech or wanting to use it more holistically for your transition cows, ask one question, seek one problem to solve, and work over time, continuously monitoring and assessing how that change is influencing the health and productivity of your cow, right? And then build from there. You can't solve all the problems at one time. If we could, I wouldn't have a job, Dr. Allen wouldn't have a job, so we can address things slowly over time. All right, with that, thank you for listening. Hopefully I gave you some things to think about. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Do we need? Oh, go for it.
Is there some longer term ongoing research that's looking at like the production and outcome and economics of implementing management strategies to address those cows with subclinical disorders that are identified because of their baseline information over either like the course of a lactation or that cow's lifetime? Like, where's the research headed for that longer term analysis?
That is a great question. That is where the research is headed. So, like I mentioned, transition cow biology and understanding how all of these disorders fit together and influence one another, it's still evolving. And technology is great, but of course it comes onto the scene as we're still trying to figure out biologically what is happening with these cows. So we're bringing the research forward together. We've pretty well established, if you have dyscalcemia and early lactation, you're going to make less milk, you're more likely to get cold, what have you. So now we're looking at, can we use this technology to identify these cows, and what is the payback of early intervention, mitigation strategies, perhaps just cull her early, what have you. And so we're working on that, and that is the next step. So now we've identified these patterns and differences. So what does it mean long term? So I can't give you an exact number now, but eventually we will have it. So.
We got a comment that you did a great job, and if we could share the presentation, and this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel as well, which I think there's a link for in some of the later slides that we'll show. I have a question, Dr. Seeley. So you talked about how accurate some of these technologies are, but one of the comments that I get from farms a lot is that these things are great. They love them. They're really accurate, or like they pick up on all the cows, but they also pick up on some cows that are perfectly fine. And so they'd rather it pick up on animals, but how specific are these, or how often are some of these alerts just not really applicable to having a sick cow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, that's where understanding baseline comes in. Because it will send out a random alert on a cow that it thinks is having some sort of issue. But if you can go in, right? We have data overload. It's not going to eliminate all of the computer work and things and thinking that we want it to. If it could just like tell us an answer right away, that would be great. But we do need to critically think about what the data is actually telling us. So my recommendation, if you get that weird alert from a cow that says she's dying, go look at her, and you get there and she's totally fine. Looking back at her rumination over time will be helpful. You can also adjust the settings on your systems, which again is some work on the farmer or producer, whoever, and it puts the onus on you to adjust those settings. I know that I've gone through that effort with our farms here because we milk in rather unique systems in a tie stall and an organic. So the preset settings of sensitivity were not where they should be for our specific farm. So it does take a time to adjust how sensitive specific markers, specific alterations that you want the system to pick up on. But that can help with those weird false negatives that do pop up. I think the payback rate, though, is if most of the time it's indicating cows that truly do need help, and there's just the occasional weird cow that says she's dying, but she's really fine. If I was a producer using the system for herd health reasons, I would be okay with that, unless it was happening all the time, and then I would be mad. But not really an answer to your question, but you can adjust settings in the programs and have like your tech sales rep help you with that too. So
Okay, so the sales reps are pretty good at helping with adjusting those settings for the most part.
at least in my experience, yes. And most of them, I mean, I can only speak to the system we have. I've never messed around with another farmer's system, but they're pretty easy to just change on your own. But I will say, if you do go in and change your sensitivity of a rumination decrease, give it like a few months before you decide that it worked or it didn't work, because it's going to take a while for the system to adjust, figure it out, and also collect enough data on your own to know if, hey, this change actually worked. So it's not going to fix the problem overnight. You need to wait and be patient and give it time to fully adjust.
I have one more question too.
Okay.
So we also have farms that are using these for repro and health, and but they don't have them on all of their animals. Obviously, with Smax Tech, you can't move them, but if you don't have a bolus, they're moving ear tags and collars. Given that now we're looking at rumination time at dry off and things like what could be most useful, what timeline would you say if you're going to move collars and ear tags around because you don't have them on all of them? This is the most important for health reasons to keep those collars on those animals.
Yeah, that's a great question. And they are expensive, right? So if you can't put them on every single animal, don't, right? But there is a way to work around that. I would say, so right off the bat, in order for the systems to figure out what is that cow's normal, that's a big, key takeaway here is understanding normal. It needs usually 2 weeks to figure out her normal. So if you're going to target using these on your early lactation cows or cows in that transition period, I would put it on 3-4 weeks before her expected calving, because like the research that I showed, there is some indication that prepartum, especially in that last week leading up to calving, is somewhat indicative of postpartum health. So if you put it on 3 or 4 weeks prepartum, you're gonna have the 2 weeks of identifying her baseline, and then you should get at least 1 week of prepartum data that you can trust and rely on and interpret those changes to then follow through to that prepartum period. So if you slap it on her when she calves, you're going to miss your window of opportunity because you're not going to know her baseline probably for at least 3 weeks because so much is happening as she calves in anyway. I would put it on several weeks before she's expected to calve, and that should give you a pretty good idea of some indicator of health or unhealth during that time.
All right. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Seeley? Okay, Amber, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Do you want to pop the slides back up there?
Oh, I can do that.
All right, our second quarter theme for 2026 will focus on precision agriculture technology and systems that support decision making from the field to the barn. So this was a great transitionary session for us today. In April, we will be joined by Matt Newman and Ben Weichert from Dairy One, and they will discuss some of the tools that Dairy One offers to address lameness, feed management, and crop management. And you can scan there to register or just visit our conference and events page. And Susan has dropped the link into the chat for our survey, and we would really appreciate if you could take a minute to fill that out. And thank you for joining us today.